Hi everyone, welcome back. It's Nilise here, and I thought that today I would talk a little bit about how to DM a horror campaign. This is one that I've had questions about IRL, so I thought it would be a really good one to go up first, or close to first. um, uh, my background in this, I have DM'd almost a year now, over a year now, of Call of Cthulhu, which is a very, very fun role-playing game. Highly recommend it. But in that, I have sort of done a lot of horror and really work to make sure that that horror is not truly terrifying and uncomfortable for the players at my table. As such, I thought I would go through sort of what I do before I start DMing for horror campaigns so that it might be something you can try or something you can jump off of and build from. I'm not end of final word. I am just hopefully telling you some tools that might be useful. So let's jump into that. So, to start DMing a horror campaign, the first thing you're going to want to do is choose a system and find some players. For me, I really enjoy the Call of Cthulhu system. I have also used the Storyteller system before, which is the same system that I believe Vampire the Masquerade runs on. Both wonderful systems, great for roleplay, highly recommend them. And also, what I would sort of point to and push you to for horror games. I find that horror games are usually more successful if it is a role play based situation, especially since you, as a DM or GM, will be doing a lot of narration. Having something that gives the players the ability to control that narrative can be really useful. Once you have your setting picked out, or not your setting, sorry, once you have your system picked out, you're going to need to find some players. This has always been the easiest part for me, but I understand that if you're new to DMing, this can be really, really overwhelming. I will go into a different video at some point on how to find players for role playing games, and hopefully I get that up fairly soon so you can have those tips. For now, if you are looking, I highly recommend putting a message in either a message board or just saying it in a group of friends you hang out with. Usually, there are going to be people in a room that also play role playing games and that would love a chance to play another one, especially if it's something a little bit more obscure like a horror game. So, you're going to find some players. This is the most important point, and everything else that this entire sort of video is going to be based around is going to be based off of those players you find. Different players are going to have different requirements. Different tables are going to have different gameplay needs. This is standard for anything you're ever going to do in a TTRPG because people are different. And so no matter how well you know one group of players, if one change happens, that could be completely different the next day. Always, 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 please pay attention to your players. If you take away nothing else, pay attention to your players. Please. So, now that you have both a system and some players, what do you do next? Well, this is the part where the different DMs will tell you different things. For me personally, I like to have individual meetings with my players and a session zero with the entire group. Some people might find this unnecessary, some people might not need to do this. Completely fine, no way is incorrect, unless you're not having a session zero, but that's a whole other conversation. No way is incorrect. There's just ways that are going to work better for different player sets. If something isn't working for your table right now, it might be worth trying out something new. Or if you have something that works for you, great. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So, what I like to do is I like to start with single one on one player interactions. For me, this is me as a DM sitting down with my player and going, okay, do you have any ideas for what you like in horror or what you don't like in horror? This is where I will start to look at the genre of my campaign and sort of base that around what I like in horror, but also what my players like in horror. So if somebody says, oh, yeah, I really hate gore or blood and guts, like I can't deal with humans being disfigured in any way, I'll be like, cool, that doesn't go in the campaign. Thank you for telling me. And this is sort of the same thing I do with everyone. I do plan on having a document linked either in the blurb down below or on my other websites that you would be able to download and use. I don't know how soon after this video that will go up, but that should be there eventually. So you're going to ask some questions such as, what genres do you like? Are there any things in horror you hate, you can't stand, anything like that? For you people who know RPGs, TTRPGs a little bit better, this is where I would like to ask the lines and veils of my players. And for those of you who aren't super into TTRPGs, lines are basically hard lines that you are never ever going to go past or touch on in a TTRPG. this could be, for example, we don't kill kids. Great. We don't put dead kids in the campaign. Easy. They're not there. They don't exist. Veils, on the other hand, are things that can sort of be in a campaign, but you need to be really, really careful about, or you can't go super in detail on. Veils are going to be the harder part of this because you could refer to them. So again, using the dead kids example, you could say that like, oh, you see a photograph of a 5-year-old child on the mantelpiece, and then not describe the kid in any other part of the house. Okay. Or it could be, yeah, sometimes I'm okay with having dead kids in a piece of media. Sometimes I'm not. And that's one of those where then you as a DM are going to have to make that call in game at the table. Is that something that the table wants today? Is that something that is healthy for the table today? And I'll talk a little bit more later in the video on how to identify when things are and aren't okay. So, learn lines and veils, learn what genre, and the last thing I like to do is I like to set a personal safe word with each of my players. This is a safe word that none of the other players at the table know. It's also a word that I make sure is not going to come up in campaign naturally. So, for example, I have a 1986 Call of Cthulhu campaign, and so a couple of the players have picked items from the 80s that a player could feasibly have on them at any time. They're never going to use that item, but if, for example, they say, oh, my character takes a tube of lipstick out of their purse, I suddenly know, hang on, you're safe wording, I'm cutting the game. And the thing that I make very, very clear to all of my players whenever I do that is whenever you safe word, I, the DM, am the one who cuts the game. I never make it clear that anyone else did. I never insinuate everyone else did. What I do at my table is I say, hey guys, I'm going to take a 5-minute break. I'll be back in a bit. And then I leave to take that 5-minute break, but that also gives my player the time they need to maybe reconnect, recuperate after whatever happened in game. If they're comfortable with it, I would also talk to them at that point to make sure that whatever it was that made them safe word doesn't occur again. However, this is also a conversation that could happen after session if they're not comfortable with it happening sort of during that 5-minute break. So that's what I like to do in one-on-one sessions, along with getting any information on any potential characters. That's fully optional because I do understand it's very early in the sort of game process, so you might not have a good idea on setting yet. So the next thing then I like to do before game is the session 0. And I am a very, very firm believer of the only wrong way to DM is to not do a session 0. Whether that session 0 is everyone together in the same place, or whether that session 0 is one-on-ones with each of the players, I don't care. I do care that there is a session 0. The show is called Once More with Feeling. You have to understand the feelings, and to do that, you have to talk to your players outside of the game. Cheers. So, in a session 0, what I like to do is I like to go over the lines and veils that I've already heard. I like to give my players the opportunity to add any additional lines and veils. And I like to set an expectation across the entire table. What genre of horror am I doing? This is something that you might not have a very clear answer on. This is something that you might have a crystal clear answer on. That's fine. I like to set an expectation on what the deadliness level for a campaign is and what the horror level of a campaign is. What I mean by horror level is not like 0 through 10, how scary is it? What I mean with horror level is, are you looking more at psychological horror? Are you looking more at cultural horror? Are you looking more at like things that can happen in the real world today? Or are you meaning magical horror, sci-fi horror that can't happen today? I ask these questions because people deal with horror differently. I am a big horror wuss. I don't like horror, so I tend to be really, really careful with it. Some people, they could have me describe their bones breaking and snapping in their body and want more. Okay, great. If the rest of the table agrees, I can try. But basically go through the same things you did in the one-on-ones. Don't call out, or it's suggested not to call out who said different things. That has the ability to maybe make your players feel defensive or off balance, and that is not ever something you want at your table. Not unless it's part of the intended role play that all parties have opted into. So, You go over that. You go over lines and veils. You go over genre. You go over deadliness. And this is where you can bring in any other safety tools you want to use during your game. Now, there's many different safety tools out there. A bunch of them have been used by a lot of people successfully. A bunch of them have shortcomings. That's sort of the downside with any tool. There's going to be pros, there's going to be cons. One of the safety tools I do go over in the group setting is this guy back here, my beloved safety duck. So the safety duck at my table takes the place of an X card at a different table. And what an X card is, it's basically just a sheet of paper ripped out that has a big X drawn on it that you put in the center of the table where everyone can reach it. And if at any time anyone feels unsafe or wants to stop the game for any reason at all, they just touch it. And when you touch it, the game immediately stops. Everyone immediately stops role-playing and you check in. The thing about the X card, and the reason that I also implement the safe word system with it, is I have previously been in a game where I did not feel safe using the X card because I did not want to basically stop the other people at the table from having fun. This is why I have the safe word system, because it would allow any players the opportunity to stop the game without calling attention to the fact that they're the ones who stopped the game. Is it a perfect system? No. It means I have to remember extra things as a DM. But it works for me, and it's worked for my table. And so I figured I would share it in case it helps yours. So I think that brings us to the end of what our sort of pre-session horror is, which means we can move into the second part, which is how do you actually DM or plan a horror game? You've got your system, you've got your players, you've got maybe a setting. You certainly have a genre if you guys talked about it in your session zeros. So, assuming you've already planned out all of your world and everything, which I know is a really hard thing and I want to go into more in depth later, but right now I'm focusing on the safety tools. Now that you've got everything, you're sat down, you're at the table, the dice are out, emotions are high. How do you narrate horror? That's something that can be really, really hard, especially depending on what horror it is and what horror you as a DM like to sort of read about or watch. For me, what I like to do is I focus and I lean heavily on a lot of narration. I describe how the sinews and the fibers in your musculature twist and snap, pulled to their absolute breaking point before you feel that pressure release and the pain flood in. Some people I know focus on there's a guy in front of you. He's big, he's scary, he's CR12, and you guys are level 3. Also pretty scary. The threat of death is a big one. The point is, there's no one way to DM horror. This is the part that's going to be the most personalized to both you as a GM and your players as a table. What you're going to want to do here is, honestly, practice. Whether that's talking to yourself in the mirror and describing horrifying things, whether that's getting feedback from your players on things they like and things they don't like. DMing horror is going to be intrinsically different from DMing something like fantasy, just because you're going for a different tone at your table. I tend to lean very, very heavily into the physical sensations and the feelings a player would have, because that's something that's sometimes difficult to get across at a gaming table. As the DM, as the GM, you are the player's eyes, ears, touch, smell, hearing. You are their everything. They can't interact with the world unless you give them a world to interact with. Describe the smell of rotting corpses. Describe the squishing, slouching sound as they step in fresh blood. Describe the sounds they hear as the wolves that are bearing down on them snap twigs under their feet and growl through the mist. Tell them what's happening. And this is where it gets important, because here's where we slip back again into DMing is about feelings. When you're describing things, I would suggest looking at your players. Because especially in things like horror, generally people have physical responses to fear. One of the things that I like to do when I'm DMing is I pay attention to those, so that if somebody starts to get a bit too scared or it looks like somebody might need to safe word or X card soon, I can already pull back on the narration, sort of step back on that horror a little bit before they actually need to. This is something that takes a lot of practice. And I also understand that this is something that not everyone is naturally gifted at or naturally able to do. That's why I'm going to mention just a couple of things here that I like to look out for. It's not a comprehensive list, but it might help you. One thing I like to look out for is body language. A lot of the time, if you're scared, you're going to start to sort of hunch in or pull back, covering sort of the face, the neck, any sort of place where there's sensitive arteries, veins, organs, anything like that. If somebody starts pulling into themselves, they're likely scared or getting scared. Another one is eyes going wide, breathing speeding up a little bit. It sounds cliche, and that's kind of because it is. Those are sort of the classic signs of horror. And so if anyone starts to get more like that than they normally are, you might want to think about pulling back in the narration a little bit, or checking in verbally at the table, hey guys, we good, can I keep going? Some players will have a very different response to horror. Some players will freeze completely in their seats, which makes it a lot harder to identify. You're basically trying to find an absence of something, which unless you know that person already, which I hope you do, because you had that session 0. That session 0 is for you to learn things. It's going to be difficult. I believe in you guys. It's trial and error. It's practice. Other signs of fear, pulling in, being very, very still. It could include being quiet. It could include things like shaking your leg, bouncing your leg, tapping on the table, flipping a pen. Basically look for things that your players don't normally do. It might not be fear. It might be fear. I like to verge on the cautious side, just because I don't want people to feel unsafe at my table. You might know the people at your table a bit better and know that you don't need to be that cautious. Cool. Do what works for your table. Do what works for your table. And if something isn't quite working, don't be afraid to change it up. So, now we get into the what if something happens? Well, it's not an if question. It's a when question. Something will happen. We are playing a game that is all about role-playing, that is all about emotions, that is all about math. 3 very confusing things, and so something is going to at some point happen. Hope for the best. Expect the worst. Do everything you can to avoid incidents, to avoid people feeling unsafe at your table. Expect that at some point in your DMing, it will happen. And that's not a failure. That's not a failure on you. That's not a failure on your players. Things happen. We have emotions, and that's good. Sometimes we need to pay attention to them. Here's what I've done. Here's what works for me. It might not work for you. What I like to do is the first thing I do is I call time. I basically go, hey guys, we're either stopping the game completely today or we're stopping it for a little bit today. This is also a call that if I am not the one that needs to step out, if it's one of my players, I generally let my players make that decision. At one point, my player actually said, Valentine, can we stop? Which caught me by surprise. I was not expecting that. But I went, yeah, of course, what's wrong? Are you willing to share? And they wonderfully told me that just this session was not going well. This session was actively unfun. So what I did was I decided to offer them okay, there's a couple of options here. We can quit today right now, and we can come back next week to finish, or we can keep going. We will go under the assumption that every roll succeeds, that every action is working in some capacity, and I will basically speed run us through the rest of this session. My players ended up picking that option, which was really fun, and it actually created some very, very memorable moments and some recurring characters that came back in a very big way in that campaign's finale. After the session, and actually during the session, we had a good 15 to 20 minute break where we sat there and we just talked it through. What did we want the rest of the session to look like? How were we going to deal with today? And then at the end, after I had finished everything, it was a, do you guys have any advice or anything I want to change for next week? Something happened. We had an incident at the table. You don't have to write up an incident report, but you do need to look at it and see how you can prevent something like that in the future, if you can prevent something like that in the future. We ended up deciding that for the system that we were playing in, the rules that we had been running were not working for our table. So that week, I went back, I did some sort of rebalancing, some rescraping, and decided that going forwards, failure was going to be less severe, and success was just going to be a little bit harder. And it worked really well for us. So incidents are not always bad. They're awful. They suck to sit through, especially if you're the one who has to call time. But in the long run, it will make your game better if you talk about things. You don't need to talk about them during the game. You can always come to your DM outside of session and go, hey, last week, it was getting really close to the edge of what I'm okay with. Are you ever going further? Can you pull back a little bit? Sometimes DMs make mistakes. I would expect DMs to make mistakes. We're people at a table, and that's just kind of what happens sometimes. Don't beat yourself up about it. Talk to your players about it. And if need be, make sure you apologize. It may not always be your fault. It doesn't have to be something you have done maliciously. Sometimes a single apology of, hey, I'm sorry that this happened at my table, can mean a lot to a player. I would highly, highly recommend that whatever you do, you never say, I'm sorry you feel, or I'm sorry you felt. That can be very, very hurtful to hear. And even if you don't believe you did anything wrong, saying, I'm sorry that you were, saying, I'm sorry that I hurt you during the last session, or I'm sorry you were hurt during the last session, is going to be a much better apology than, I'm sorry you felt hurt. So, we've talked a little bit about how to DM during a horror campaign. We've talked a little bit about what to do if an incident occurs. What else is there? All right. That I do think brings us to the end of what to do during a game. So I'm going to talk about the next section, which is what do you do after horror? All right. You've just had a successful session or an incident. Neither are failures. What do you do now? Well, it's a very simple answer with a very complex implementation. Aftercare. What I like to do anytime after I have DM'd any sort of horror is make sure I sit with my players for a minute outside of the game at the table and just go, hey, how is everyone right now? And it doesn't always have to be the phrase, how is everyone right now? It can be, what do you guys think about this? How are you guys feeling? It can be something so much as, was the horror today good? One that I actually really like to use because it sounds more like it's on me and I'm checking in so that I can do something different is, did you guys find that scary enough? Or was that scary for you guys? Or how can I make the horror better? If you make it sound more like you are asking because you want to do something better or because you want to improve, it can also be easier for other people to open up. So something along the lines of, did you guys enjoy that monster? Did you guys enjoy that narration? Those can be very useful questions because players might be more willing to open up. Talk for a little bit about what they liked. Talk about what they didn't like. Talk about things that they think could be more intense or things that they were like, hey, I'm really glad you stopped there, or please stop before you get to that point. All right, you're going to see a cut there because I started to use an example and I don't want to use real examples about other people. So I'm going to give the same sort of information, but I'm going to change the facts a little bit so that I'm not just putting somebody on blast. I was DMing a game at one point, and I heard that I had done something that that horror was really good. They really enjoyed it. They enjoyed having it. It was very horror inducing. It was uncomfortable. It was not necessarily psychological horror, it was more like body horror. And it was great and they loved it, but they were really, really glad I stopped when I did. And this is why being able to identify horror in your players is so important, because I was only able to pull back and sort of rein that in because I saw that they were becoming scared. So one of the things that I really like about aftercare is basically after that session, because I had asked, they told me, yeah, don't ever go past that point. Like, that was my limit. And I was like, cool, I won't go past that point. And so far I haven't. That campaign is still in progress. Talking to your players is going to give you the most information about how to improve your DMing and about how to be successful at a table. I highly recommend that you communicate with your players, that you talk with your players. So talk about them. Aftercare, talk about what they liked, talk about what they didn't like. Something that I also really like to do is after a session, especially after a very intense horror session, we just talk about life. We talk about, oh yeah, I went to the zoo this week and it was fun. Or, oh yeah, I was watching this new TV show. And just talk about something that is different, that is normal, that maybe even elicits positive emotions. It can really help in sort of recalibrating yourself to go out after a session into the world. This may or may not be necessary depending on your players. It's always depending on your players, and it's always depending on the table that you're a part of. I like doing it because I find that it really helps have people excited to come and play a game with me. I also find that it increases the camaraderie of a party a lot, to have connections outside of game. I am thrilled whenever my players get together without me and decide on like social plots they want to happen between their characters. Or I've had players go like, hey, my character's going to do this. Is this okay? Is this okay with you and your character? I think that's phenomenal. That's exactly what I want to hear as a DM. And I really do think that sort of the aftercare, the knowing people outside of sessions, is what helps with that. So I would really highly suggest afterwards, you have a glass of water. If there's any snacks left over from the session, have a little bit of a snack and just talk. Make sure that everyone's okay. Make sure that your players know that you'll listen to them, that you admire and accept their feedback because you want to make a game for everyone to enjoy. You can't please everyone in the world at the same time. And that's why DMing advice is always going to be so vague, because, or at least why my DMing advice is going to be vague. Listen to your players. Your players and those at your table are going to be able to give you the best advice you have ever had. And that advice might not be applicable for your next campaign. It's about learning. It's about flexibility. Messing up is not a personal failure. It is a chance to get better. Especially in aftercare. Don't be afraid to say that you are sorry. I know it sounds cliche. Saying those words can mean a lot to a player, especially a player that has just had to use an X card or use a safe tool. Make sure they know that you want them to be safe at your table. Make sure everyone in your party knows you want them to be safe at your table. If something happened, feel free to text them later that week or before your next session and just go, hey, I know that something happened last time. I'm sorry it did. I am doing this step to make sure that doesn't happen again. Or can we talk about this so that I can, avoid that topic in future? Aftercare is not always looking at people's emotions. That's most of what it is. Sometimes it is also collecting the information that you need to make sure it doesn't happen again. Both of those things are incredibly important. They're important at different times most of the time. So, first thing you need to do, make sure your players are okay. Make sure that you are okay. Second thing you need to do, how are you going to prevent that from happening in future? Or, if it was really good and it's just the standard like, oh, we had a horror game aftercare, how are you going to make that next session good too? Are you going to lean more into what you know they like? Are you going to twist it just a little bit to be a little bit new, a little bit unknown? It's your horror game. It's however you want to do it. So I hope this helped a little bit. Once again, I tried to keep this very sort of system independent so that it could be applicable to D&D, Call of Cthulhu, Vampire the Masquerade, anything you want to run. If you guys are interested in more specific tips, I can certainly try and give those. Most of them might be done in a different video or in a different sort of format because getting into the math of everything can be a lot sometimes. So, thank you all for watching, and it's end card time. All right, well, the sun decided to come out the one day I decided to film this week, but that's all right. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Anything I decided to link below will be down there in the blurb. And yeah, have a lot of fun. I hope to see you next time. Feel free to check out my Patreon or my Ko-fi. Both ways you will get sort of text updates, whether or not you donate, on what I'm working on. So, all right. I'll see you guys next time. And remember, always DM once more with feeling.